Max Clark, and I'm going to talk about two of the most hostile contract clauses I've ever seen and what you should be aware of. Actually, I might throw in a third bonus. We'll see if I get there. The first one, in IT and telecom, when you have a contract with a term, usually you'll have a contract that'll have a 36-month term. And at the end of this 36-month term, you'll have an auto renewal for 12 months. Maybe you've negotiated or you're getting a different type of service and you're getting a 12-month term or you're getting a 24-month term, or maybe, for the type of, you're doing a data center deal and you want a 60-month term or you want a 120-month term, you want a 5 or 10-year term. But typically what happens in these scenarios is you have initial term and then you have renewal terms. And those renewal terms could be, maybe they're crazy and they're auto renewal for the same length as the initial term. So if you had a 3-year term, it's going to auto renew for 3-year terms. That's pretty hostile. It's kind of like hostile, 0.25. But usually you have a 3-year contract with an auto renewal term of 12 months after the initial term. And then there's a notice period that says you have to tell us within, before 90 days before your renewal in order to cancel the term. Maybe, in the case of data centers or any sort of real estate, you're going to see a 10-year term with options where you can give a notice and execute an option. So you have a 10-year initial term with 2 5-year options. That's pretty normal. And in those situations, really what we're negotiating is, do you want it to be auto-renewed at 1 year? Does it make sense for it to auto-renew at 1 year? Does it make sense for the notice period? They've told you it's a 180-day notice period. That doesn't make sense for anybody. Right? Depending on the type of service, maybe it's a 3-year initial term with month-to-month terms after that. So now here's the hostile. Here's the crazy contract term. You sign a 1-year contract, and at the end of the term, there's no renewal. There's no renewal period, no renewal term, no notice, there's no option, there's no renewal term. The business development team at this company, this client of ours, when they negotiated this, they thought that they had pulled out, they had done something amazing, pulled the rabbit out of the hat when they negotiated this term. The problem with it became when the client was approaching the end of their term, they weren't really sure what they were going to do and what they needed to do going forward. They actually wanted to switch providers. Let's actually put it out there on the table. They wanted to switch because they weren't really happy with their service provider. They wanted to go to another service provider. Migrations take a lot of time. They had to take planning, they take support. The losing provider has to provide you, even if they provide you actually no support, they have to provide you some support because you're going to have to get into their data, into their systems, move things from point A to point B, whatever it is. And the incredible thing that happened with this company, with this client, was, when they're about 4 or 5 months out, so at a reasonable time, they started actually looking at this contract really seriously and having internal conversations about whether or not they wanted to stick with their incumbent provider if they actually did want to switch. And they were having performance issues, they were having service and support issues, and they were having a cost issue. So, it's like the trifecta on the Venn diagram, all circles intersect with the point that says, hey, it's time to go. It's time to go. And if you've ever been involved with a larger company procurement, it just takes a while. Even if you already identified your provider, you still have to go through, an RFP or RFI process. You have to competitively bid. You have to validate it. You have to go through legal. There is a time to contract. And then after that time to contract, then you have a time to implementation and migration. That could be 6 months. It could be actually a lot longer than 6 months, but let's just say it's 6 months. Now, what happened here is our client was going through this process and decided somewhere about the 3-month before their contract end that they wanted to move, wanted to go to a different provider. They had selected the other provider. They were in contract negotiations with the other provider. And they went out to their incumbent provider and they said to the incumbent provider, basically, I don't think they told them that they were going to leave, but they weren't saying that they were going to stay. And they said, we need some more time to make a decision. So we're going to just go month to month with you when this contract expires in 3 months. And the provider came back and said no. Provider said this contract it ends on this date, and the following day at midnight that date, if there's not a new contract in place, we're turning off service and we're deleting the data. They were done. It was host. They were done. The timeline that they had available to them at that point did not give them the ability to even think about completing contract negotiations with their new selected provider. There was no way that they were going to be able to get a migration in place before their end date. There was just no way. They were done. They were completely done. They spent a couple of weeks trying to get accommodations from the incumbent provider to give them a short extension, 3 months, 6 months, while they could negotiate the rate, because then they were saying that they were going to need time to negotiate the renewal. And the provider just said no. It was amazing. And not only did the provider say no, the provider pulled a Judge Judy. If you haven't heard about Judge Judy and her negotiations, this woman is an absolute boss. This provider slid the piece of paper across the table and said, here's what we're offering. Sign this or don't. 3-year renewal, increase in rate, mandatory this, like the whole thing just absolutely crushed them. The provider had them in a vice and knew it, and they squeezed them hard. And there was nothing they could do. The client's option was scramble, pray, and risk a major outage and disruption to their business, which was not available, or swallow the new contract and suck it up. And that's what they did. They had to sign it, and they had to suck it up, and they had to agree to it. There was no negotiation. It was just whoosh, sign this or else. Sign this or don't. We don't care. Your contract's over. You're out. We've already written your revenue off. You want to keep going? Sign this or not. So that's the first one. Second most hostile thing I've ever seen happen with a client in their contract was language embedded in their MSA that stipulated that any changes to existing services or any new service orders executed for new services, and here's where this got really tricky, is it didn't even require signed documents. Anything that was requested within the support system. So if you called in to their NOC, or if you issued a ticket and then requested a change, it triggered this clause. So any changes to an existing service would effectuate a new service term for that service. And any new service order that was signed would co-term all previous services with the same dates and terms of the new service order. I mean, just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. So the client found out about this because two things. They thought they had a series of layered service orders with this provider, and it was different services impacting different systems, and they had this list, and they had all their service orders, they had all their terms, they had their expirations, their start date, their end dates, and they had all their ducks lined up. And what they were going to do is, as these services dropped off, they were going to terminate them, and in some cases they were going to move some to other providers, they were going to consolidate other ones. I mean, that was basically it, right? They were going to let them drop off completely, they were going to consolidate, or they were going to switch to a different service provider. And when the first one came up, and the first time that they tried to actually do this, they sent their notice, because they knew, we have to give 91 plus days of notice. So they sent in their 92-day notice. And by the way, this was calendar days. They didn't run the risk of the business day nonsense. So they sent in their notice about this thing. And when they were going through the process of terminating the first service, they found out that they were still in contract for another 2.5 years because they had submitted a service order. It was 7-8 months earlier. I'm trying to remember the exact details. It's a little blurry. But there was a service order that was implemented that was then created this triggering event for coterminous. And then a couple months after that service order went into place, they requested a change to that service via the ticketing system. I mean, the whole thing was just such a mess. And so they ended up with this thing where they thought they had all these services. By the way, they had budgeted around these things dropping off or consolidating or moving to other providers. They had done annual budgeting around this stuff. And we're not talking about a couple of dollars here. We're talking about, 6-7 figures worth of services that they were going to realign and budget that they had allocated. And it was the same thing. They found this out. And then what do? The termination clauses were, your normal, just incredible things. And same thing. The director of business development, who had been tasked with negotiating all the contracts for this company, they had no idea. They'd never negotiated a service provider contract before and had no idea of what the actual real world implication of this language was. And it looked okay to them. They didn't know. They didn't know any better. They know better now, but they didn't know better then. And, as an outsider that was involved with the mess, I mean, it was just spectacular. Just the disaster that this caused. Because again, not only do you have a budgeting cycle, but you have an entire engineering laid out sprint cycles around product development, deployment, and release, and all these different things that were just all poof. The entire product plan for that year just went completely up in smoke because they couldn't do it. And the trickle down for it was just next level. It was unbelievable. Okay, so here's my bonus, third one. This one was me personally. I'd signed a data center contract with a very large data center provider, and we were doing a deployment for one of our clients. It wasn't a couple hundred servers. I don't remember if it was 200 or 300. It was enough that we had between the servers, between the cabinets, the mounting equipment, the ladder racking, the PDUs, the servers, the switches, everything else. We did one delivery ourselves where we got a 40-foot flatbed truck, and the manufacturer we bought the cabinets from was local and drove down. They just drove forklifts on, and we did cabinets ourselves. But the server and network equipment and the rest of the stuff came shipped by the manufacturer light freight. If you've ever seen a semi-truck full of servers, it is a lot of packing material. One RU server, right? So 1.75 inches, about that tall. So a server is 1.75 inches tall, it's 19 inches wide, and it's some depth. Depending on the manufacturer and what you've actually got onto it, it's going to have some depth to it. It could be anywhere from 18 to 30 some odd inches, right? And that's why they're called pizza boxes. If you've ever heard that term, they're called pizza boxes because, they're roughly the same size as a large pizza box. Maybe that's a better visual for you if you've never seen one of these things. It basically kind of resembles, roughly dimensions of a pizza box. That's the pizza box analogy. That server comes in a box, and that box can be anywhere between 9 and 18 inches tall. So you've got a server that's this big being packaged in a box. I'm not going to fit on the screen, right? You know, like it could be 1.5 feet tall, right? And then of course there's space around the sides and all these different things. So it's a lot of volume, and there's a lot of stuff in it, right? It's your classic like Amazon thing of like, you've got this, you know, you ordered a box of Kleenex and it came in this giant box and it makes no sense. You know, and every server comes with manuals. It comes with wire management arms, which you shouldn't use, but I'll get into that later. It comes with DVD drives. I mean, it's a one-size-fits-all box, you know, and they just throw everything into it with different packing on the inside of it to make it make sense. So after you unpack 300 servers and switches and wiring and PDUs and everything else that you go, what do you have? You have a lot of refuse. You have a lot of cardboard. You have a lot of waste. You have a lot of stuff you got to do something with. And this was the gotcha. We found out that the data center operator did not provide trash services unless it was specifically negotiated in your contract with them, which we did not do because we had never had this problem before, which I did not do because I had never had this problem before with any data center provider ever in the history of me doing data centers at that point. Why would you think about we need to have access to a dumpster, right? Like this is not a normal thing that exists in the realm of the IT sphere, right? And of course, the other complexity with this is now you have combustibles on the data center floor because you have the pyramids of cardboard, you know, from all this equipment that's been unpacked that's just stacked, which cannot stay on the data center floor because it's a fire hazard, and that's counter to data center facility rules, right? So the data center operator trying to be like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, I can't use the dumpster to throw this stuff out. I can't have my teams go out and take out all this stuff. At the same time, we're dealing with the facilities people who are yelling at us that we can't have cardboard on the data center floor because it's a fire hazard. And we're like, we want to get rid of the cardboard, but we don't have a dumpster. So we had to find a dumpster service. One of these giant 40-foot long things. And then, by the way, now you got to get a dumpster in. So now you have to coordinate taking over the loading dock because you need space to put the dumpster. You can't park it on the street. It's got to go in the loading dock. So now we've got to get a special date. We've got to get approval. It can only be there for so long. We've got to coordinate it. The truck has to show up at a certain time. It's got to drop it off in the designated area. We've got to do this mad dash to get rid of the cardboard. Truck has to come back and get rid of it. The whole thing is crazy. So probably want to experience that one, but I would say this is something that I'm very, very attentive to when we're negotiating data center contracts for our clients is trash available when you get this deliveries. I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff that we're looking for in data center contracts, but I just put this here as a little bonus, a little bonus item of a just massive gotcha in a contract that I've dealt with. I'm Max Clark. I'd love to hear your contract gotchas. Comment below. Let us know. Love to hear from you.
Feeling.